Now I have enough research material to write the script. Let me compose the long-form documentary script based on this extensive research about underwater archaeological discoveries, with the Cuban site as a primary anchor and Thonis Heraclean as a factual counterpoint.
In the winter of 2001, a research vessel chartered by a small Canadian survey company called Advanced Digital Communications was conducting routine side-scan sonar sweeps off the Guanahacabibes Peninsula, the westernmost tip of Cuba. The team, led by a Soviet-born ocean engineer named Paulina Zalitsky and her husband Paul Weinsweig, had been contracted by the Cuban government to locate colonial-era Spanish shipwrecks believed to lie scattered across the seafloor of the Yucatán Channel. Hundreds of galleons had sunk in those waters over 3 centuries of imperial trade, and the potential salvage value was significant. But as the sonar transducer swept its fan-shaped acoustic beam across the bottom, painting a grayscale image of sediment and bedrock on the monitors above, something appeared that did not fit the profile of a wooden hull or a cannon field. At a depth of approximately 650 meters, the instrument returned images of geometric regularity, smooth planes intersecting at sharp angles, what appeared to be rectangular blocks arranged in a pattern too organized to be geological happenstance. The sonar painted a picture that resembled, in its broad architecture, something closer to the footprint of a planned settlement than the chaos of natural erosion. Zalitsky and Weinsweig returned the following year with a remotely operated vehicle equipped with cameras. What the ROV recorded at that depth, more than 2,000 feet below the surface, showed enormous smooth-faced blocks of stone, some appearing circular, others apparently pyramidal, spread across an area of roughly 2 square kilometers. The footage was ambiguous, as deep ocean footage invariably is, shadowed and lit only by the vehicle's forward-mounted lamps, but the forms were undeniably striking. Zalitsky told reporters she believed it could be the remains of a large urban center, while cautioning in the same breath that it would be irresponsible to make any definitive claim without proper evidence. The story reached Reuters, the BBC, and newspapers across 3 continents within days, and by the end of the week, the word Atlantis had surfaced in nearly every headline attached to the discovery. What happened next is perhaps more revealing than what was found. Almost nothing happened. No major university dispatched a team. No government funded a return expedition. No peer-reviewed paper emerged from the data. The site sits today, more than 2 decades later, essentially untouched by further investigation, suspended in a peculiar limbo between sensation and obscurity. The reasons for this silence are instructive, and they tell us as much about the mechanics of deep ocean exploration as they do about the structures themselves. The depth at which the Cuban formations rest is the first and most decisive obstacle. 650 meters is not the relatively accessible shallow water in which most underwater archaeology takes place. The great majority of known submerged archaeological sites lie in depths of fewer than 50 meters, reachable by human divers with standard scuba equipment or, in more challenging cases, by saturation diving systems that can push trained operators to around 300 meters for limited durations. Below that threshold, human presence becomes impractical, and the work must be conducted entirely by robotic proxy. ROVs, capable of operating at 600 meters and beyond, exist, but they are enormously expensive to deploy, requiring dedicated support vessels, launch and recovery systems, tether management, and specialized operators. A single day of deep ROV operations can cost tens of thousands of dollars, and the kind of systematic excavation that archaeology demands, slow, meticulous, grid-referenced, artifact by artifact, becomes almost prohibitively expensive at those depths. The financial model that supports shallow water archaeology, whether through academic grants, government heritage funding, or commercial salvage agreements, simply does not scale to the abyssal plane. This economic reality intersects with a political one. Cuba in 2001 was deep within its special period austerity, the long economic contraction following the collapse of Soviet subsidies. The United States maintained a comprehensive trade embargo that made any collaboration between American institutions and Cuban partners legally fraught. European and Canadian researchers could theoretically access the site, but without substantial institutional backing, the cost of mounting a proper deep-water archaeological campaign remained beyond reach. Zalitsky's company, a small commercial outfit rather than a research institution, lacked the resources to continue alone. The site slipped from the news cycle with the speed that characterizes most archaeological stories that cannot deliver ongoing visual spectacle. But the scientific objections to the site's artificial origin are at least as significant as the logistical ones, and they deserve serious attention rather than dismissal as establishment gatekeeping. Manuel Iturralde Vina, a geologist at Cuba's National Museum of Natural History who examined the sonar data and some of the ROV footage, raised a fundamental problem of timescale. For human-built structures to exist at 650 meters depth, one of two things must be true. Either the sea level was once that much lower than it is today, or the land on which those structures stood must have sunk by that amount since they were built. Sea level during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, was approximately 120 to 130 meters lower than present levels. That is the maximum plausible depth at which coastal human settlements might have been inundated by post-glacial sea level rise alone. 650 meters is 5 times deeper than that maximum, which means that sea level change cannot account for the site's current position without invoking some additional mechanism of vertical displacement. Tectonic subsidence is the obvious candidate, and the Caribbean is indeed a seismically active region. But geological subsidence occurs at rates typically measured in millimeters per year. Even at an unusually rapid rate of 5 millimeters annually, sinking a landmass by 500 additional meters beyond what sea level rise could explain would require 100,000 years. Any human-built structures would need to date from a period far earlier than any known civilization, pushing back into the Middle Paleolithic, when the archaeological record shows no evidence anywhere on Earth of the kind of monumental architecture the sonar images seem to suggest. Iturralde stated the problem plainly. The geology does not support the timeline required for these to be artificial constructions, at least not constructions made by any society resembling those known to archaeology. The alternative explanation that the formations are natural is less dramatic but far more consistent with what geologists understand about submarine rock morphology. Nature produces geometric regularity with surprising frequency. Columnar basalt, formed by the slow cooling of lava flows, fractures into hexagonal pillars that can appear strikingly architectural. Sedimentary rock, particularly sandstone and limestone, often fractures along orthogonal joint sets, producing blocks with flat faces and right-angle intersections that mimic quarried masonry. Submarine erosion by currents can preferentially remove softer material and leave harder layers standing as flat-topped terraces that resemble platforms or stepped pyramids. The Yonaguni monument off the coast of Japan presents a strikingly similar case, a formation of sandstone layers that fracture along natural bedding planes and joints to produce what appears to be a stepped pyramid with flat platforms, right angles, and regular proportions. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus spent decades arguing for its artificial origin, while geologists like Robert Schock pointed out that the rock type involved, a fine-grained sandstone, naturally fractures in exactly the patterns observed. The debate has never been resolved to universal satisfaction, but the geological explanation remains the default position in mainstream science because it requires no extraordinary assumptions. This is the epistemological core of the problem. Side-scan sonar, for all its sophistication, produces images rather than knowledge. It measures the intensity of acoustic backscatter from the seafloor, and it does so with a resolution that depends on frequency, range, and towing speed. At the depths and ranges involved in the Cuban survey, the resolution was likely measured in meters rather than centimeters, meaning that fine details which might distinguish carved stone from naturally fractured bedrock were simply not captured. The ROV footage, while providing higher visual resolution, covered only fragments of the site and was taken during brief passes rather than systematic surveys. Without physical samples, without stratigraphic excavation, without radiometric dating, without microscopic analysis of tool marks or construction techniques, the question of artificial versus natural origin cannot be resolved by images alone, however suggestive those images might be. And yet the suggestion persists, not because the evidence is compelling in a scientific sense, but because it touches something deeper in the collective imagination. The idea of a submerged civilization, a great society lost beneath the waves, carries a psychological weight that far exceeds its empirical basis. It belongs to a category of narrative that Joseph Campbell might have recognized as a fundamental mythic structure. The drowned world, the lost golden age, the civilization that exceeded its bounds and was punished by the sea. From Plato's account of Atlantis in the Timaeus and Critias to the Hindu tradition of Dwarka, the city of Krishna submerged beneath the Arabian Sea, to the Norse legends of sunken lands and the Celtic stories of drowned kingdoms off the coasts of Wales and Brittany. The motif recurs across cultures with a regularity that suggests it answers some deep human need. The ocean, which covers 71% of the planet's surface and whose floor remains less than 30% mapped by modern high-resolution sonar, functions as a screen onto which we project our anxieties about impermanence and our hopes for hidden continuity. What makes this projection powerful is that it is not entirely without foundation. Cities have been lost to the sea. The archaeological record confirms this repeatedly and unambiguously. The difference between legend and evidence lies not in whether submersion occurs, but in the mechanisms, timescales, and depths involved. Tonis Heraklion, the great Egyptian port city rediscovered by French underwater archaeologist Frank Godiot in the year 2000, offers the most instructive comparison. Here was a city that genuinely vanished from human knowledge for over 1,000 years. A city mentioned by Herodotus and Strabo, visited by Helen and Paris in legend, the obligatory port of entry for all Greek ships bound for Egypt, and yet so completely lost that scholars debated whether it had ever existed at all. Godiot found it 6.5 kilometers off the modern Egyptian coastline in Abu Qir Bay, beneath approximately 6 meters of water and a thick blanket of marine sediment. The contrast with the Cuban site is instructive in every dimension. Thonis Herakleion lies in 6 meters of water, not 600. Its submersion is explained by well-understood geological processes. The combination of soil liquefaction triggered by earthquakes, gradual tectonic subsidence of the Nile Delta sediments on which it was built, and the slow rise in Mediterranean sea level over 2 millennia. The timeline is archaeologically coherent. The city flourished from the 8th century BC through the 4th century BC, declined as Alexandria rose to prominence, suffered catastrophic structural collapse around 101 BC when saturated delta sediments liquefied during a seismic event, and finally disappeared entirely beneath the water by the 8th century AD. Every aspect of this timeline is consistent with known geological rates and historical documentation. When Godiot's team began systematic excavation, they found not ambiguous sonar shadows, but unambiguous artifacts. Colossal granite statues of pharaohs and gods, gold coins, bronze ritual objects, ceramic vessels bearing Greek and Egyptian inscriptions, more than 700 ancient anchors, 70 shipwrecks dating from the 6th to the 2nd century BC, and a stele bearing the decree of Nectanebo I that finally proved Thonis and Heracleon were a single city known by two names. The evidence was not suggestive but conclusive, not a matter of interpretation but of direct physical recovery. And still, after more than 2 decades of work, Gaudio estimates that only 5% of the city has been excavated. Even in 6 meters of accessible, warm, relatively clear Mediterranean water, the pace of proper underwater archaeology is measured in decades rather than years. This contrast illuminates why the Cuban site remains unresolved and likely will for the foreseeable future. The tools required to definitively characterize formations at 650 meters, physical sampling, core drilling, systematic photogrammetric mapping, sediment analysis, do not currently exist in a form that underwater archaeology can afford to deploy. The technology exists in the offshore oil and gas industry and in deep-sea mining exploration, but the cost structures of those industries dwarf anything available to academic or heritage-funded research. A single deep-water drilling ship operating in the Gulf of Mexico costs upward of $500,000 per day. The economics of knowledge do not favor the resolution of ambiguity at abyssal depths. There is a broader pattern here that extends well beyond any single site. The ocean floor, despite representing the majority of Earth's solid surface, remains one of the least documented terrains in the solar system. We have higher resolution topographic maps of Mars and the Moon than we do of most of the deep sea floor. The Seabed 2030 project, an international collaboration launched with the goal of mapping the entire ocean floor by the end of this decade, reported that as of early 2024, approximately 26% of the global seafloor had been surveyed with modern multi-beam sonar. The remaining 74% is known only from satellite-derived gravity measurements, which provide a resolution of roughly 1 to 2 kilometers, far too coarse to identify anything on an archaeological scale. What this means in practical terms is that we do not know what is down there. We cannot say with confidence what the deep ocean floor does or does not contain, because we have not looked at most of it with instruments capable of revealing anything smaller than a mountain. This ignorance creates a space in which the imagination flourishes, and not always irresponsibly. There are legitimate scientific reasons to wonder what coastal landscapes looked like during glacial periods when sea levels were significantly lower. The continental shelves, which extend to depths of roughly 100 to 200 meters before dropping off into the deep ocean, were largely exposed as dry land during the last ice age. Human populations certainly occupied those now submerged landscapes. The evidence is indirect but substantial. Stone tools dredged up by fishing trawlers in the North Sea from the drowned landscape of Doggerland, a region that once connected Britain to continental Europe and supported Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities before being inundated between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. Submerged prehistoric sites have been documented off the coasts of Israel, where the Neolithic village of Atlit Yam lies in 8 meters of water, preserving 9,000-year-old houses, wells, and even a stone semicircle that may have served a ritual function. The principle that rising seas destroyed coastal settlements is not speculative, but archaeologically demonstrated. What remains speculative, and what the Cuban site represents, is the extension of that principle beyond its demonstrated range. The known submerged sites are shallow, young in geological terms, and belong to cultures otherwise documented in the terrestrial archaeological record. They are lost villages and port towns, not lost civilizations. The gap between a drowned Neolithic fishing settlement at 8 meters and a hypothetical monumental city at 650 meters is not merely quantitative but qualitative. It requires not just more water but fundamentally different geological history, and it implies not just an undocumented settlement but an entirely undocumented level of social complexity, at a period when no such complexity is evidenced anywhere else on Earth. This does not mean the question is uninteresting or unworthy of investigation. It means that the investigation must be conducted with the rigor that the claim demands, and that rigor is expensive, slow, and unlikely to produce the kind of immediate, visually dramatic answers that sustain public attention. The history of underwater archaeology is in large part a history of patience, of careful accumulation of evidence over years and decades, of technologies gradually becoming affordable enough to extend human reach into deeper water. The bathyscaphe gave way to the submersible, which gave way to the remotely operated vehicle, which is now being supplemented by autonomous underwater vehicles capable of conducting surveys without continuous human oversight. Each generation of technology has pushed the accessible depth a little further and the cost a little lower. It is not impossible that within the coming decades, the tools needed to properly characterize the Cuban formations will become available at a price that archaeological research can bear. Until that time, the site exists in a condition that is uncomfortable for both believers and skeptics. For those inclined toward the extraordinary interpretation, the lack of follow-up feels like suppression, a story too threatening to established narratives to be allowed investigation. For those inclined toward the geological explanation, the lack of definitive disproof leaves a residue of uncertainty that popular culture exploits. Neither position is entirely wrong. The site has not been adequately investigated, and this is a failure of resources rather than will. And the geological explanation, while parsimonious, has not been confirmed by the kind of direct physical analysis that would settle the matter beyond dispute. What we can say with confidence is that the ocean has swallowed real places, real histories, real human efforts that persisted for centuries before disappearing beneath the surface. Thonis Heracleion is only the most spectacular recent example. The ancient Indian city of Dwarka, mentioned in the Mahabharata as the kingdom of Krishna, has been the subject of underwater archaeological investigation off the coast of Gujarat since the 1980s, with the Marine Archaeology Unit of India's National Institute of Oceanography documenting stone structures, anchors, and artifacts in the shallow coastal waters. Port Royal, Jamaica, once called the wickedest city on Earth, slid into the Caribbean during an earthquake in 1692, and its submerged streets have been excavated since the 1950s. The Roman resort city of Baiae, playground of emperors, lies partially submerged in the volcanic caldera of the Bay of Naples. Each of these sites shares certain characteristics. They are shallow, they are historically documented, and their submersion is explained by well-understood local geological processes rather than by catastrophic or mysterious mechanisms. The deeper ocean offers no confirmed parallels. This may be because there are none to find, because human civilization has never existed at the depths and in the locations where truly dramatic subsidence could carry it to the abyssal floor. Or it may be because we have not yet developed the capacity to look with sufficient care. The honest answer is that we do not know, and the honest response to not knowing is neither credulity nor dismissal, but a patient, properly funded, technologically capable inquiry that is yet to be undertaken. What the title of every sensational claim about underwater cities conceals is this more mundane, but ultimately more interesting truth: that the interface between human settlement and the sea is dynamic, unstable, and poorly documented. Cities are being lost to the ocean in the present tense, not in some mythic past. Coastal subsidence, driven by groundwater extraction, sediment compaction, and tectonic movement, is causing measurable sinking in cities from Jakarta to New Orleans to Venice, at rates of several millimeters to several centimeters per year. The archaeological sites of the future are being created now, in slow motion, and the archaeologists of subsequent centuries will face the same challenges of underwater investigation that we face today when looking at the relics of antiquity. The empire beneath 4,000 feet, if it exists at all, exists beyond our current reach in every sense, beyond our technological capacity to excavate, beyond our geological models to explain, and beyond our archaeological frameworks to accommodate. Its power lies precisely in that inaccessibility, in the fact that it can be neither confirmed nor denied with the tools presently available. It occupies the space between knowledge and imagination, where both science and myth draw their sustenance. And perhaps that is its most important function, not as evidence of a lost past, but as a reminder of how much of our own planet remains genuinely unknown, how thin the margin of explored territory actually is, and how much of what we call knowledge is bounded by the depth to which we can afford to send our instruments. The ocean keeps its secrets not through malice or mystery, but through the simple, indifferent physics of pressure, darkness, and distance. The forgotten empire, if it was ever an empire at all, waits in that darkness with the patience of geology, indifferent to whether we come looking or not.